Evening everybody, it is Tuesday the 16th of August and we are going to begin a run of Canadian whiskies from Canada. And what better one to start with than probably the biggest selling, most well known, not necessarily the biggest selling as I found out, but probably the most well known Canadian whisky around the world, which is this one, Canadian Club Classic. So this was a miniature donated by Chris and Lindsay Cook. There's Chris there. Thank you very much for this one. I think Andrew A.P. Butler did actually send me a sample of the Canadian Club 12-year-old, but I had this from Chris, so I've got the 12-year-old aside, and when I meet Andrew again I will give that back to him. But it would be interesting to see what it's like compared to this, but I'm not going to do that as well. So, Canadian Club, as I say, if you know Canadian whiskies, you've probably heard of Canadian Club. It was created in 1858 by Hiram Walker, who became a very big, basically a whiskey mogul entrepreneur. This is what Hiram looks like, or looked like, because he's obviously dead now. He had a grocery store in Detroit. And this is where Detroit is, if you don't know where it is in America. And began, he actually learnt to distill using cider vinegar and then began making whiskey. But this was before Prohibition, but there were still sort of dry counties and there were still issues with alcohol selling. And he moved his operation to Canada, as I will probably tend to call it while I'm doing this run. Now here's a close-up of the map, and you'll see that Canada from Detroit is not very far away at all. It is literally jump across the river and you're in Canada. So it was in the Canadian, is it a state or province? I think it's a province in Canada of Ontario, and it was a place called Windsor. So he set up the distillery in Windsor, and began actually creating a community within Windsor, which became known as Walkerville, and I think it was the 1920s actually became a recognised sort of township within Windsor that was called Walkerville and is still there now. So when the Prohibition movement kicked in sort of mid 1910 to 1920, so sort of 1915 onwards, when it kicked in for real, there was a loophole within Canada where you weren't allowed to sell it to hotels and restaurants, but you could still make whiskey and spirits for export. And with it being over the road from Detroit, it was a big sort of loophole that basically was massive smuggling of alcohol into America. Al Capone apparently was smuggling thousands of cases of what became Canadian Club, but originally was known as Club Whisky. So Hiram Walker produced this whisky, which was a blended whisky from Canada, and it became known, it was quite highly regarded within gentlemen's clubs because Hiram was producing this and marketing this as a premium whisky. So American whiskies and bourbons at that time were sort of, you were lucky if they were aged any longer than 1 year. It really was, you make it, you get it out, you put it in cask for a little bit to try and get some flavour and colour, and then you get it out there and you sell it. Whereas Walker's whiskey was aged 5 years in oak, so it was a long production process, but it was a lot better. Much smoother, much nicer to drink. So he was premiumizing. You know, this is well early in the days of kind of premiumizing a brand and all this nonsense that you get nowadays, particularly with places like Diageo. But this is what he was aiming for, and it was very popular in gentlemen's clubs and in USA and Canada, and it became known as Club Whisky. Now, because it was getting really popular and it was from Canada, a lot of US distillers really weren't happy with this because it was like, well, this is an outsider coming into our territory. So they forced the government to pass a bill where whiskies made from outside of the US had to have their country of origin. Now, the thinking was that by putting that it was from Canada on the label would put people off buying it, and it didn't. In fact, it made it stand out even more because all of a sudden there was sort of copycat versions out there. There was various styles with club in the name, but this club whiskey that the people were drinking in these clubs was from Canada, and it said it on the label, and immediately it distinguished it from all the other American whiskies. So they utilised it, and ultimately club whisky became known as Canadian club whisky. It was product of Canada, then it became bigger type, and it was Canadian at the top, but still known as club whisky. And then ultimately, I think it was about did I write it down how when it came in? 1890, sorry. 1890 was when it became known as Canadian Club. That was the name of the whisky. So, they also were given royal warrants. Hiram Walker is the only North American distiller to actually get a royal warrant. It was from Queen Vic and a couple of others afterwards as well. It's I think there's sort of 3 or 4 sort of dished out by various members of royalty. Like I say, only North American distiller to do so. So really, really highly regarded. Canadian Club probably gets a bit of a bad rap. You know, I doing my research and sort of looking at comments and being on various Facebook groups, it tends to get a bit kind of like looked down upon, but it's really, really sort of popular and actually has some provenance. So we're looking at a combination of rye and barley and also corn. Now, on the Canadian Club website themselves, they make no apologies, no hiding. They say that corn whiskey is flavourless and odourless spirit that they use as their base whiskey. They flat out say it. They use the rye and the barley for the flavour, and the corn whiskey is the base whiskey, is the base spirit. Don't know what the percentages are in terms of, it could be 80% corn whiskey and then 10% rye and 10% barley. Who knows how the actual makeup is, but that is the constituent parts of this whiskey. It's 40%. Now, Canadian Club Classic, the standard version, is aged for 6 years. Whereas they do have a 12-year-old, and they've got some other versions as well. In fact, today on Facebook, a guy called Chris Trevino, who does the Liquor Hound YouTube channel, which is well worth checking out. Coincidentally, he actually put a post up where he tried the 30-year-old, and apparently it is this just aged for 30 years rather than the standard 6. And he was very, very waxing lyrical about that in a big way. So I honestly can't remember if I've had Canadian Club at all in my life. If I have, I can't remember it. In the mid-60s, it was 1967 the first time they did this. They actually had a marketing campaign called Hide a Case, and they hid cases of Canadian Club in various spots around the world, like up Mount Kilimanjaro and in the Amazon forest and things like that. They've done it a few times over the years. I think the last one was in the mid-80s, 85, and they've done it about 3 or 4 times between 67 and 85. They hid 22 cases apparently, and only 16 of them have been found. Some of them have just never been found. They were really obscure places. There wasn't really any clues to where they were, and they've never been found at all. These was like special cases with prizes in. Apparently there's rumour going around that they are going to do another one, but it will be like a case, but it will be a $10,000 prize or something like that. Really weird campaign, and losing you stock as well, which seems a bit daft. So, now it's 40%. Yes, 40%. Weirdly, in New Zealand and Australia, it's released at 37%. Which is a little bit odd. They've got slightly different rules down there in terms of how you can, the ABV for selling whiskey. I can't remember which one it was I had, where I did actually have a sample where it was under 40%. Was it Cougar? Might have been Cougar. But yeah, they actually have a lower legal limit. So quite a few whiskies that are released over there are at a lower alcohol percentage. But this is 40. Smells a little bit of paint. It's quite spirity on the nose. It's not fiery, but it's a thin spiritiness, which is why it reminds me of paint. There is a graininess to it as well, though, and by graininess I mean sort of fields of corn and hay. It is quite thin and spirity, though. It's not harsh, but it's just got a rawness to it. Now, to be honest, it is pretty much marketed as a mixing whiskey. It's not really pushing itself as a drink this neat, take your time over it, that sort of thing. It really is it's a cheap-ish whiskey. You're looking at about, it was Whisky Exchange was selling this for 18 quid. Which is still expensive-ish, but it's from in the UK. We've got to get it from Canada. We've got to import it. There's taxes, there's shipping, there's customs, there's all that lot. So it's on the cheaper end of whiskey, but you can still get cheaper bourbons and particularly Scotch blends, of which this is competing with, for less than that. The rawness is there still. The spiritiness, it's not rough. It doesn't hit the back of your throat and strip it. There's just not a great deal there. There's a sort of toffiness to it, and it's almost slightly sour as well. It really kind of like puckers you up a little bit. It's not brilliant, but I don't think it's meant to be drunk neat. I honestly don't. I don't think it's supposed to be. It's not made to be a neat drinking. It is a high volume, cheaply produced, cheap to purchase whiskey to be made to be mixed and drunk in bars with mixers and cocktails and that sort of thing. It's not made to be sat in front of the fire to take your time over, or to be as an aperitif or a digestif or anything like that. It's not made for that. It started off as a premium product because at the time everything else that was released predominantly was rough as anything, even more cheaply made. And at the time this was actually kind of like the cost of production was quite high because you had to mature it for 5 years. They use ex-bourbon casks as well, so there is that. It doesn't really taste like a 6-year-old. Now it is Canada, but it's so close to America you can almost do it, but it's the north of America, so you don't have the heat that places like Kentucky and Texas and all that lot do. So you don't have that kind of increased aging. In terms of climate, it's closer to Scotland than somewhere like Texas would be, and even then it's even more doesn't get as hot, but it gets a lot colder. So the cool air, the cold climate that's there actually can hinder the maturation in a cask, because the heat of warmer climates actually gets the spirit kind of moving within the cask and expanding with the heat and everything like that. When it's cold, it's almost dormant. So you wouldn't taste this blind and go, oh yeah, that's at least a 6-year-old. It does taste very, very young indeed, but 6 years in cask in somewhere like Canada is almost the equivalent of probably 3 to 4 years in a more temperate climate. It's not awful. The sweetness overrides the harshness that would be there. It's a little bit cloying. I'm not sure I'd want to drink any more neat. The sweetness probably goes, in fact, to be honest, the sweetness probably goes really well with something like Coke. It would make it a really, really sweet whiskey and Coke, but then it would be really easy to drink, and doesn't surprise me that lots of people drink it that way. In fact, it's got even more cloying. It's really quite sugary sweet, as well as this quite pungent, sharp spirit feel that comes through to it. It's okay. Would I pay 18 quid for a bottle of it? In the UK? No. Would I spend about $12 in America? Maybe. I'll be honest though, some of the cheap bourbons that I had that were about that $12 mark, I would prefer over that, simply because they've got a bit more, slightly more richness to it, and slightly less of the cloying sweetness. It's okay. It's not awful. It's not really awful. But I probably wouldn't buy a bottle myself, to be honest. But if you're going to a party and you're making a punch, or you know that everybody's drinking whiskey and Coke, it would probably do the job absolutely fine. Right, quick rinse out, and then we will crack on with our next Canadian, which is Canadian something else. See you then. Cheers.